When did your doctor learn that medical licenses aren't immunity? Dr. Nathan Graves told me I was being dramatic about my heart palpitations in September, even though I'd come to his office 3 times in 2 weeks describing the exact same symptoms. Racing heartbeat that lasted for hours, chest pressure that made it hard to breathe, dizziness so severe I'd nearly passed out twice at work. I was 28 years old, with no history of anxiety or panic disorders. I told him I knew the difference between stress and something physically wrong with my body. He smiled in that condescending way doctors do when they've already decided you're wasting their time and said stress could cause all sorts of symptoms people didn't recognize. He suggested I try meditation and maybe cut back on caffeine. I explained I'd already eliminated caffeine completely, and the palpitations were getting worse, not better. He typed something into my chart and said he'd prescribe a low dose of anxiety medication to help me relax. When I asked about getting an EKG or seeing a cardiologist, he actually laughed and said I didn't need to see a specialist for stress-induced symptoms. He told me that ordering unnecessary tests would be a waste of my insurance company's money and his time. He printed out the prescription and handed it across the desk, saying most of his patients found that once they addressed their anxiety, their physical symptoms resolved on their own. I took the prescription but didn't fill it because I knew something was genuinely wrong with my cardiovascular system. The palpitations weren't triggered by stress or worry. They happened randomly throughout the day and night, sometimes waking me from sleep with my heart racing at what felt like 200 beats per minute. I started documenting everything in a journal. Date, time, duration, what I was doing when it started, associated symptoms. After another week of episodes happening multiple times daily, I called Dr. Graves' office and asked to schedule a follow-up appointment. The receptionist said he'd noted in my chart that I should try the anxiety medication for at least 30 days before coming back. She suggested I give it time to work. I explained I hadn't filled the prescription because I was certain this wasn't anxiety. She put me on hold and came back saying Dr. Graves recommended I find a therapist to work through my health anxiety before scheduling another appointment. Health anxiety. He'd actually written in my chart that I had health anxiety. I asked to speak with him directly and she said he was with patients all day, but she'd leave him a message. He never called back. 3 days later, I was standing in the kitchen making dinner when my heart rate suddenly spiked so high I could see my chest visibly pounding through my shirt. The room started spinning, and I grabbed the counter to keep from falling. My vision went dark around the edges, and I felt like I was going to die right there on the kitchen floor. I managed to call 911 before I collapsed. The paramedics found me unconscious, with a heart rate of 230 beats per minute. They transported me to St. Mary's Hospital, where the ER doctor took one look at the EKG and immediately admitted me to the cardiac unit. I woke up in a hospital bed with electrodes stuck all over my chest and an IV in my arm. A cardiologist named Dr. Patricia Osei came in and asked how long I'd been experiencing these symptoms. When I told her 2 months and that my primary care doctor had dismissed it as anxiety, her expression went completely flat. She pulled up my EKG results on the computer in my room and turned the screen so I could see it. She pointed to specific patterns on the graph and explained I had supraventricular tachycardia, a condition where the electrical signals in my heart were misfiring and causing dangerous rapid heartbeats. She said it was completely unrelated to anxiety and required immediate treatment. Dr. Osei asked if I had copies of my medical records from Dr. Graves. I told her I could request them, and she said she wanted to see exactly what he'd documented about my symptoms. She explained that SVT was usually diagnosed with a simple EKG, which should have been the first test ordered when I described cardiac symptoms. The fact that he'd dismissed my complaints and prescribed psychiatric medication instead of doing basic cardiac screening was, in her words, deeply concerning. She said I was lucky the paramedics got to me when they did because sustained heart rates that high could cause stroke or sudden cardiac death. I asked why Dr. Graves would tell me it was anxiety when a simple test could have found the real problem. Dr. Osei said she couldn't speak to his reasoning, but she strongly suggested I file a complaint with the medical board once I was stable enough to focus on it. She said patients who described clear cardiac symptoms should never be dismissed without proper diagnostic workup, regardless of their age or medical history. She also mentioned that she'd seen an increasing number of cases where younger patients' cardiac symptoms were misdiagnosed as anxiety, when the same symptoms in older patients received immediate testing. I spent 4 days in the cardiac unit while they stabilized my heart rhythm with medication and monitored me for additional episodes. The hospital social worker, a man named Gerald Finch, came by my room on the 3rd day and asked if I wanted help requesting my medical records from Dr. Graves. He said he'd worked with other patients who needed documentation for medical board complaints and knew the process. I said yes, and he brought me the forms to sign. He also gave me information about medical malpractice attorneys and patient advocacy organizations. He told me what happened to me wasn't just bad luck or a misdiagnosis. It was negligence. A doctor who ignored clear cardiac symptoms and prescribed psychiatric medication without proper testing had failed to meet the basic standard of care. He encouraged me to document everything while it was fresh in my memory. Every appointment, every symptom I'd reported, every time he'd dismissed my concerns. He said detailed documentation would be crucial if I decided to pursue any kind of action against him. Dr. Osei performed a cardiac ablation procedure to correct the electrical pathways in my heart that were causing the SVT. The procedure itself took about 3 hours and required threading catheters through my veins to reach my heart. When I woke up, she explained the ablation had been successful, but I'd need to stay on medication and come back for regular monitoring. She also told me that if Dr. Graves had ordered an EKG during my first appointment, the SVT would have been caught immediately and treated before it progressed to the point where I needed emergency intervention. The delay in diagnosis meant I'd suffered through 2 months of dangerous cardiac events that could have killed me at any time. She was documenting all of this in my medical records, along with her professional opinion that the delay in diagnosis constituted a departure from the standard of care. She asked if I was planning to pursue legal action, and I said I was seriously considering it. She told me I should absolutely consider it, and that she'd be willing to provide expert testimony if needed. I requested my complete medical records from Dr. Graves's office the day I was discharged from the hospital. They arrived 2 weeks later in a thick envelope. Reading through them made my hands shake. He documented my first appointment by writing that I presented with vague complaints of palpitations that were likely stress-related. Vague complaints. I'd described specific, measurable symptoms in detail. Racing heartbeat, chest pressure, near syncope episodes. None of that was vague. For my second appointment, he'd written that I was fixated on cardiac concerns, despite reassurance that my symptoms were benign. He documented my third appointment by noting I demonstrated health anxiety and was resistant to psychiatric treatment. He'd actually written that I was resistant to treatment when I'd simply asked for cardiac testing before starting psychiatric medication. His notes painted me as an anxious, difficult patient who refused to accept his clinical judgment. There was no mention of the specific symptoms I'd reported, no documentation that I'd described episodes lasting hours, no record that I'd told him the symptoms were worsening. He'd created a narrative in my chart that made me look unreasonable, and himself look appropriately cautious. I made copies of everything and scheduled a consultation with a medical malpractice attorney named Kevin Brennan. His office was downtown in a building that overlooked the river. He spent an hour reviewing my medical records, the hospital records from my SVT diagnosis, and the timeline I'd written out documenting every interaction with Dr. Graves. When he finished reading, he leaned back in his chair and said I had one of the clearest cases of medical negligence he'd seen in years. A patient presenting with classic cardiac symptoms who was dismissed as anxious without any diagnostic testing, followed by a life-threatening emergency that required hospitalization and surgical intervention. He said the fact that Dr. Graves had mischaracterized my symptoms in his notes actually worked in my favor, because it showed he'd documented information that contradicted what any reasonable physician would have done. Kevin explained that medical malpractice cases required proving 4 elements: duty, breach, causation, and damages. Dr. Graves had a duty to provide competent care. He'd breached that duty by failing to order appropriate testing. His breach directly caused my delayed diagnosis, and I'd suffered significant damages, including emergency hospitalization, surgical intervention, and ongoing cardiac monitoring. Kevin asked if I'd filed a complaint with the state medical board yet. I said I hadn't, but Dr. Osei had strongly recommended it. He told me I should absolutely file with the medical board, because their investigation would be separate from the lawsuit and could provide additional documentation of his negligence. He explained that the medical board investigated complaints to determine if a doctor had violated professional standards, and their findings could result in disciplinary action up to and including license suspension or revocation. He said even if the medical board investigation took time, it would be worth pursuing because it created an official record of his misconduct. He offered to help me draft the medical board complaint, and I accepted. We spent another hour going through the specific details I needed to include. Every symptom I'd reported, every time he'd dismissed my concerns, the falsified characterization of my complaints in his medical records, and the ultimate outcome of emergency hospitalization and surgical intervention that could have been avoided with a simple EKG during my first appointment. I filed the medical board complaint on a Friday morning in November, exactly 6 weeks after my cardiac ablation. The complaint was 12 pages long, with attached copies of all relevant medical records. I described each appointment in detail, quoted his exact words when he dismissed my symptoms as anxiety, and explained how his failure to order basic cardiac screening had nearly killed me. I included Dr. Osei's medical opinion that the delay in diagnosis constituted a departure from the standard of care. I also mentioned that he'd falsified his documentation by describing my symptoms as vague when I'd provided specific detailed descriptions of classic cardiac symptoms. The medical board sent a confirmation letter saying they'd received my complaint and assigned it to an investigator. They said the investigation could take several months, and they'd contact me if they needed additional information. Kevin said that was standard procedure, and we should focus on building the malpractice case while the board conducted their investigation. Kevin filed the medical malpractice lawsuit 3 weeks later. The complaint sought damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, emotional distress, and the ongoing cost of cardiac care I'd require for the rest of my life. The total amount we were seeking was $850,000. Dr. Graves was served with the lawsuit paperwork at his office on a Wednesday afternoon. His attorney, a man named Charles Rothman, called Kevin the following Monday, asking if we'd consider settling before the case went to discovery. Kevin told him we weren't interested in settlement discussions until we'd conducted a full investigation into Dr. Graves's practice patterns. Charles said his client maintained he'd provided appropriate care and had acted within the standard of practice. Kevin responded that the medical records spoke for themselves, and we looked forward to deposing Dr. Graves under oath. Charles got quiet and said he'd be in touch. Discovery started in January. Kevin subpoenaed Dr. Graves' complete patient files for the past 5 years, looking for patterns of dismissed complaints or delayed diagnoses. We were specifically searching for other cases where he'd misdiagnosed serious conditions as anxiety or stress without proper testing. The files arrived in 14 boxes. Kevin hired a medical consultant to review them, a retired physician named Dr. Malcolm Wright, who specialized in reviewing malpractice cases. Dr. Wright spent 3 weeks analyzing the records and found 7 other patients who'd presented with potentially serious symptoms that Dr. Graves had dismissed without appropriate testing. One man had described severe abdominal pain that he'd diagnosed as irritable bowel syndrome without ordering imaging. He'd ended up in the ER 2 months later with a ruptured appendix and nearly died from sepsis. Another man had complained of severe headaches and vision changes that Dr. Graves treated with migraine medication. 6 weeks later, he'd been diagnosed with a brain tumor that required emergency surgery. 3 other patients had described symptoms that suggested thyroid disorders, autoimmune conditions, or neurological problems. All of them had been diagnosed with anxiety or depression without proper diagnostic workup. All of them had eventually been diagnosed with serious medical conditions by other doctors after their symptoms became severe enough to require emergency intervention. Dr. Wright prepared a report detailing every case where Dr. Graves had failed to meet the standard of care. The report was 47 pages long and concluded that Dr. Graves demonstrated a pattern of dismissing patient complaints without conducting appropriate diagnostic evaluation. Dr. Wright noted that this pattern suggested either incompetence or a deliberate decision to avoid ordering tests that would require time and documentation. Either way, it represented a serious threat to patient safety. Kevin sent copies of the report to Charles Rothman and to the medical board investigator handling my complaint. Charles called 2 days later and said his client wanted to discuss settlement terms. Kevin told him we'd consider settlement after Dr. Graves' deposition. We wanted his testimony on record before any settlement discussions happened. Charles reluctantly agreed, and we scheduled the deposition for February 14th at Kevin's office. Dr. Graves arrived for his deposition in a charcoal suit with his attorney beside him. We all sat around the conference table while the court reporter set up her equipment. Kevin started with basic questions about Dr. Graves' medical training, credentials, and years in practice. Then he pulled out my medical file and asked Dr. Graves to explain his clinical reasoning for diagnosing me with anxiety when I'd presented with classic cardiac symptoms. Dr. Graves said he'd performed a thorough clinical assessment and determined my symptoms were most consistent with anxiety based on my age and the absence of risk factors for cardiac disease. Kevin asked what specific aspects of my clinical presentation had suggested anxiety rather than cardiac pathology. Dr. Graves said young people frequently presented with stress-related symptoms, and it was more likely that I was experiencing anxiety than a serious cardiac condition. Kevin pointed out that SVT wasn't particularly rare and asked why Dr. Graves hadn't ordered an EKG as a precautionary measure. Dr. Graves said he hadn't felt it was medically necessary based on his clinical judgment. Kevin then asked Dr. Graves to explain why he documented my symptoms as vague when I described specific episodes of tachycardia, chest pressure, and near syncope. Dr. Graves hesitated and said he'd summarized the chief complaints in his notes. Kevin asked if describing specific cardiac symptoms as vague complaints was an accurate summary. Dr. Graves said he'd documented what he felt was clinically relevant. Kevin asked if Dr. Graves considered documented complaints of racing heartbeat and near syncope to be clinically relevant when evaluating potential cardiac symptoms. Dr. Graves started to answer, then stopped and looked at his attorney. Charles told him to answer the question. Dr. Graves said those symptoms could have multiple causes, including anxiety. Kevin asked if anxiety could cause sustained heart rates of 230 beats per minute. Dr. Graves admitted it could not. Kevin asked why he hadn't ordered testing to rule out cardiac causes before diagnosing anxiety. Dr. Graves said he'd used his clinical judgment to determine the most likely diagnosis. Kevin asked if that clinical judgment had included considering the possibility that he might be wrong. Dr. Graves didn't answer. Kevin moved on to the other patients Dr. Wright had identified. He presented each case and asked Dr. Graves to explain his clinical reasoning. The man with the ruptured appendix, the man with the brain tumor, the 3 patients with undiagnosed autoimmune and endocrine disorders. Dr. Graves gave similar answers for each case. He'd performed clinical assessments. He'd used his medical judgment. He'd diagnosed the most likely conditions based on the information available. Kevin asked if Dr. Graves had noticed a pattern in his practice where patients he'd diagnosed with anxiety or psychosomatic symptoms later required emergency medical intervention for serious physical illnesses. Dr. Graves said he hadn't noticed a pattern. Kevin asked if 7 cases over 5 years constituted a pattern. Dr. Graves said complications sometimes occurred in medical practice, and hindsight made outcomes look preventable when they weren't. Kevin asked if performing basic diagnostic tests before concluding symptoms were psychosomatic might have prevented some of those complications. Dr. Graves said he couldn't speculate about hypothetical scenarios. Kevin asked if an EKG was a hypothetical scenario or a standard diagnostic tool. Charles Rothman called for a break. During the break, I stood in the hallway outside the conference room trying to steady my breathing. Hearing Dr. Graves defend his decisions and minimize what had happened made my chest feel tight. He genuinely didn't seem to think he'd done anything wrong. 7 patients who'd ended up in emergency situations because he'd dismissed their symptoms. And he called it complications that sometimes occurred in medical practice. Kevin came out and asked if I was okay. I told him I just needed a minute. He said Dr. Graves was digging himself deeper with every answer, and the deposition was going exactly how he'd hoped. When we went back inside, Kevin asked Dr. Graves if he'd reviewed his practice patterns after any of these patients had been diagnosed with serious conditions by other doctors. Dr. Graves said he'd reviewed the cases, but maintained his initial assessments had been appropriate based on the information available at the time. Kevin asked if he'd implemented any changes to his diagnostic protocols after multiple patients experienced complications. Dr. Graves said he hadn't seen a need to change his protocols because each case was clinically distinct. Kevin asked if dismissing patient complaints without diagnostic testing was part of his protocol. Charles objected and told Dr. Graves not to answer. The deposition lasted 6 hours. By the end, Dr. Graves looked exhausted, and his answers had become shorter and more defensive. Kevin asked one final question before we concluded. He asked if Dr. Graves believed he bore any responsibility for my delayed SVT diagnosis and the subsequent emergency hospitalization that could have been prevented with a simple EKG during my first appointment. Dr. Graves said complications sometimes occurred even with appropriate care, and he stood by his clinical decisions. Kevin thanked him for his testimony and ended the deposition. Charles Rothman gathered his papers and left quickly without saying anything to us. Kevin turned to me and said we had everything we needed. Dr. Graves had testified under oath that he'd used appropriate clinical judgment in every case, which meant he couldn't later claim he'd made an innocent mistake. He'd defended a pattern of dismissing serious symptoms without testing, and that pattern demonstrated either incompetence or deliberate indifference to patient safety. Either way, it was devastating testimony for his defense. 2 weeks after the deposition, I received a call from the medical board investigator assigned to my case. Her name was Angela Torres, and she'd been reviewing my complaint along with the additional documentation Kevin had sent them. She said the board had expanded their investigation beyond my individual complaint after receiving the report about the 7 other patients. They were now conducting a comprehensive review of Dr. Graves's entire practice, including his prescribing patterns, diagnostic protocols, and patient outcomes. She asked if I'd be willing to participate in a formal interview where I could provide more detailed testimony about my experience. I said yes, and we scheduled the interview for the following week at the medical board office downtown. Angela also mentioned they'd contacted several of the other patients Dr. Wright had identified and were gathering statements from all of them. She said investigations of this scope usually took several months, but the pattern of behavior they'd uncovered warranted immediate attention. The medical board interview took place in a small conference room with Angela and 2 other board members present. They asked me to describe my entire experience with Dr. Graves from the first appointment through the emergency hospitalization. I spent 2 hours walking them through every detail. The specific symptoms I'd reported, his dismissal of those symptoms as anxiety, my repeated requests for cardiac testing, his refusal and recommendation for psychiatric treatment instead, the progressive worsening of my condition, the emergency call when my heart rate hit 230, the hospitalization and cardiac ablation, the permanent medication I'd need, the ongoing monitoring required for the rest of my life. Angela took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions about specific conversations. She seemed particularly interested in Dr. Graves' documentation and how it differed from what actually happened during our appointments. I explained that his notes made me seem anxious and unreasonable when I'd simply been asking for appropriate medical testing. Angela said the discrepancy between my testimony and his documentation was significant, and they'd be examining his charting practices across his entire patient population. 3 weeks later, Kevin called to tell me that Charles Rothman had reached out about settlement again. This time, the offer was substantially higher than the initial discussion. Dr. Graves's malpractice insurance was willing to offer $675,000 to settle the case before trial. Kevin said the insurance company knew they'd lose at trial and were trying to minimize their exposure. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to go to trial because I wanted a public record of what Dr. Graves had done. A settlement with a confidentiality agreement would protect him and leave other patients unaware of his pattern of negligence. Kevin said he'd expected that answer and agreed that a trial verdict would serve the public interest better than a private settlement. He also mentioned that the medical board investigation was likely to result in disciplinary action regardless of whether we settled the lawsuit. But a jury verdict finding him liable for malpractice would carry significant weight with the board and potentially influence their decision about his license. I told Kevin we should proceed to trial. The medical board completed their investigation in April. Angela Torres called to inform me they were moving forward with formal disciplinary proceedings against Dr. Graves's medical license. The charges included failure to provide adequate patient care in multiple cases, falsification of medical records, and engaging in a pattern of practice that demonstrated incompetence. The board was recommending a minimum 2-year suspension of his license pending additional remedial training, with the possibility of permanent revocation depending on the outcome of the disciplinary hearing. She said I'd be notified when the hearing was scheduled, and I'd have the opportunity to provide testimony if I wanted. The hearing would be open to the public, and other affected patients would also have the opportunity to testify. Angela mentioned that the board had received complaints from 3 additional patients after news of the investigation became public. The pattern of dismissed symptoms and delayed diagnoses extended even further than Dr. Wright's initial review had revealed. The board was taking this extremely seriously. Kevin filed a motion to have key portions of Dr. Graves's deposition admitted as evidence at trial. The motion was granted, and we received a trial date for June 8th. Charles Rothman made one more settlement offer in May, increasing the amount to $750,000. Kevin presented the offer, and I turned it down. Charles filed a motion to exclude Dr. Wright's report about the other patients, arguing it was prejudicial and not directly relevant to my case. The judge denied the motion, ruling that evidence of a pattern of practice was admissible to show Dr. Graves's knowledge and intent. Charles also tried to exclude the medical board investigation from being mentioned at trial. The judge denied that motion too, stating that the existence of a disciplinary investigation was a matter of public record and couldn't be hidden from the jury. Charles withdrew from the case 2 weeks before trial, and Dr. Graves hired new counsel, a defense attorney named Barbara Huang, who specialized in high-stakes medical malpractice defense. Barbara immediately requested a continuance to familiarize herself with the case. The judge denied it and said the trial would proceed as scheduled. The trial started on a Monday morning in early June. Jury selection took a full day. We ended up with 8 men and 4 women, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 60s. Kevin's opening statement focused on the simple fact that a patient had presented with classic cardiac symptoms, and a doctor had dismissed those symptoms without performing a basic diagnostic test that would have immediately identified the problem. He described my 3 appointments with Dr. Graves, the specific symptoms I'd reported, and his refusal to order an EKG despite clear indicators that cardiac testing was warranted. He explained that this wasn't a case about a difficult diagnosis or an honest medical mistake. This was about a doctor who'd chosen to dismiss a patient's serious symptoms rather than take the time to properly investigate them, and that choice had nearly killed me. Barbara Huang's opening statement argued that Dr. Graves had performed a thorough clinical assessment and made a reasonable judgment based on the information available. She said medical practice involved clinical judgment, and doctors couldn't be held liable every time a diagnosis ended up being more complicated than initially thought. She emphasized that I'd ultimately received appropriate treatment and recovered successfully. Kevin called Dr. Osei as his first witness. She testified about my admission to the cardiac unit, the EKG findings that showed clear SVT, and the emergency nature of my condition when I arrived. She explained that SVT was a straightforward diagnosis that any primary care physician should recognize when a patient described cardiac symptoms. She stated unequivocally that an EKG was the appropriate first test for any patient presenting with palpitations, rapid heart rate, and near syncope episodes. She also testified that the delay in diagnosis had put me at serious risk for stroke, heart failure, and sudden cardiac death. Barbara's cross-examination tried to suggest that SVT could be intermittent and might not have shown up on an EKG if the test had been performed between episodes. Dr. Osei explained that even if the EKG hadn't caught an active episode, the test still should have been ordered, and additional monitoring arranged if the initial test was normal. The standard of care required ruling out cardiac causes before diagnosing symptoms as psychiatric in nature. I testified on the second day of trial. Kevin walked me through each appointment with Dr. Graves and had me describe exactly what I'd said and how he'd responded. I explained how I'd specifically told him I wasn't anxious and knew something was physically wrong with my heart, how I'd asked multiple times for cardiac testing, how he'd laughed when I'd mentioned seeing a cardiologist, how he'd told me I was wasting his time with unnecessary test requests. The jury watched me carefully as I described collapsing in my kitchen and waking up in the cardiac unit with a heart rate of 230. Several jurors looked visibly upset when I testified about reading Dr. Graves's medical notes afterward and discovering he'd falsified the documentation to make me seem like an anxious hypochondriac who refused to accept his reassurance. Barbara's cross-examination tried to suggest I might have downplayed my anxiety during the appointments, and that Dr. Graves had reasonably interpreted my behavior as consistent with health anxiety. I responded that there was no behavior to interpret because I'd presented with specific physical symptoms and requested specific medical testing. That wasn't anxiety. That was advocating for my own health. Dr. Wright testified on the third day about the 7 other patients whose serious conditions had been missed or delayed because Dr. Graves dismissed their symptoms without proper testing. Barbara objected repeatedly, arguing this testimony was prejudicial and should be excluded. The judge overruled each objection, stating that evidence of a pattern of practice was directly relevant to whether Dr. Graves's treatment of me fell below the standard of care. Dr. Wright explained each case in detail. The man with the ruptured appendix who'd nearly died from sepsis, the man with the brain tumor who'd suffered permanent vision loss because of the delayed diagnosis, the 3 patients with autoimmune and endocrine conditions who'd spent months getting sicker, while Dr. Graves insisted their symptoms were psychosomatic. He testified that this pattern demonstrated either a fundamental lack of clinical competence or a deliberate practice of dismissing patient complaints to avoid the time and expense of appropriate diagnostic workup. Either conclusion supported a finding that Dr. Graves had breached the standard of care. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned a verdict finding Dr. Graves liable for medical negligence and awarding me $920,000 in damages. The verdict included compensation for medical expenses, pain and suffering, emotional distress, and future medical costs related to my ongoing cardiac care. The jury also included a finding that Dr. Graves's conduct had been willful and wanton, which meant he could potentially face punitive damages in a separate proceeding. Kevin requested a hearing on punitive damages, and the judge scheduled it for 2 weeks later. Barbara stood up and asked the judge to set aside the verdict, arguing the evidence hadn't supported such a large damage award. The judge denied the motion and said the jury's verdict was well supported by the evidence presented. Dr. Graves sat motionless at the defense table, staring straight ahead. He didn't look at me or Kevin. He just sat there while Barbara gathered her papers and whispered something to him. Then he stood and walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. The punitive damages hearing happened 3 weeks later. Kevin argued that Dr. Graves's pattern of dismissing serious symptoms without proper testing demonstrated a reckless disregard for patient safety that warranted additional punishment beyond compensatory damages. He presented evidence that Dr. Graves had continued practicing medicine the same way even after multiple patients had ended up in emergency situations. He'd never changed his protocols or implemented any safeguards to prevent similar outcomes. That pattern of deliberate indifference justified punitive damages to deter him and other physicians from engaging in similar conduct. Barbara argued that punitive damages weren't warranted because Dr. Graves had been practicing according to his clinical judgment and hadn't acted with malice. The judge rejected that argument and awarded an additional $500,000 in punitive damages, stating that a physician who repeatedly dismissed serious symptoms and falsified medical records to cover up his failures had demonstrated the kind of willful misconduct that justified punishment beyond mere compensation. The medical board disciplinary hearing took place in July. I attended with Kevin even though the malpractice trial was over. The hearing room was open to the public, and several reporters were present. I recognized 4 other patients from the cases Dr. Wright had documented sitting in the gallery. Angela Torres presented the board's findings, which included detailed documentation of multiple instances where Dr. Graves had failed to meet the standard of care. She described my case along with the 7 others that had been identified during the investigation. She also presented evidence of 3 additional patients who'd come forward after the investigation became public. 10 patients over 5 years who'd presented with serious symptoms that Dr. Graves had dismissed without appropriate testing. 10 patients who'd ended up in emergency situations because their conditions hadn't been diagnosed until they became life-threatening. Angela argued that this pattern demonstrated a level of incompetence and disregard for patient welfare that warranted permanent revocation of Dr. Graves's medical license. Dr. Graves testified in his own defense. His attorney presented witnesses who claimed he was a competent, caring physician who'd simply experienced some unfortunate outcomes. One colleague testified that medicine was an imperfect science, and sometimes diagnoses were missed. Another said Dr. Graves had always been professional in his interactions with staff and patients. The testimony felt hollow after everything I'd heard during the malpractice trial. When it was time for patient testimony, 5 of us spoke. I went first and described my experience from start to finish. The man with the ruptured appendix testified next, his voice shaking as he explained that he'd nearly died from sepsis and would have permanent digestive problems for the rest of his life because of the delayed diagnosis. The man with the brain tumor described his permanent vision loss and ongoing neurological issues. 2 others described months of suffering while their serious conditions went undiagnosed and untreated. The board listened carefully to each testimony. When the hearing concluded, they announced they'd deliberate and issue a decision within 30 days. 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the medical board. They'd voted unanimously to permanently revoke Dr. Graves' medical license. The letter detailed their findings that Dr. Graves had engaged in a pattern of practice that demonstrated incompetence and posed a danger to public health. They'd found evidence of falsified medical records, failure to meet the standard of care in multiple instances, and a deliberate pattern of dismissing patient complaints without appropriate diagnostic evaluation. The revocation was effective immediately, and Dr. Graves was permanently prohibited from practicing medicine in the state. The letter also stated that the board was referring their findings to the National Practitioner Database, which would prevent him from obtaining a medical license in any other state. His medical career was over. I sat in my kitchen holding the letter and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding since that first appointment in September when he'd dismissed my symptoms as anxiety. The money from the lawsuit arrived in August. $920,000 in compensatory damages and $500,000 in punitive damages, minus Kevin's contingency fee and case expenses. The final amount deposited into my account was just over $1 million. I used some of it to pay off my student loans and medical debt from the hospitalization. The rest went into investments and savings because I'd learned the hard way that financial security mattered when your health could be threatened by someone else's negligence. Dr. Osei had cleared me to return to work in June with restrictions on stress and physical activity. I'd been working as a graphic designer before everything happened, and my employer had held my position during my medical leave. Going back felt strange after months of focusing entirely on lawsuits and medical board hearings, but the normalcy of daily work helped me start processing everything that had happened. 4 months after the license revocation, I got a call from a local news reporter named Melissa Grant. She was working on an investigative piece about medical negligence and had seen the court records from my lawsuit and the medical board decision. She asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed about my experience. I said yes because I wanted other patients to understand that doctors weren't infallible and medical licenses didn't protect physicians who endangered patient safety through negligence or incompetence. The interview aired in October as part of a longer segment about medical malpractice and patient advocacy. Melissa had tracked down several other patients who'd been harmed by physicians who dismissed their symptoms. The segment generated significant response and led to discussions about improving medical board oversight and making disciplinary proceedings more transparent. In November, I was contacted by a patient advocacy organization called Medical Accountability Network. They asked if I'd be interested in joining their board and helping develop resources for patients who suspected medical negligence but didn't know how to navigate the complaint and legal processes. I accepted and started attending monthly meetings in December. The work involved reviewing patient complaints, connecting people with appropriate resources, and advocating for policy changes that would improve medical board oversight and make it easier for patients to report concerns about physician conduct. It felt meaningful to turn my experience into something that could help protect other patients from similar harm. Dr. Graves appealed the medical board's decision to revoke his license. His appeal was heard in January by an administrative law judge who reviewed the entire record of the disciplinary hearing. The judge upheld the revocation, stating that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the board's findings and the permanent revocation was an appropriate response to the serious and repeated violations Dr. Graves had committed. The judge's decision included language noting that physicians who systematically dismissed patient complaints and falsified medical records to cover up their failures represented an ongoing danger to public health and safety. Dr. Graves filed a second appeal to state court. That appeal was denied in March. His medical license was permanently revoked with no possibility of reinstatement. I ran into Dr. Graves one afternoon in May at a coffee shop downtown. I was meeting someone from the Medical Accountability Network, and he was sitting alone at a table near the window. He looked older and tired. When he saw me, his expression went blank. I could have walked past without acknowledging him, but something made me stop. I asked how he was doing. He stared at me for a long moment and then said I'd ruined his life. He'd lost his medical license, his practice, and his reputation because I'd decided to pursue a vindictive lawsuit instead of accepting that medicine wasn't perfect. I felt my jaw tighten. I told him 10 patients had nearly died or suffered permanent harm because he'd dismissed serious symptoms without proper testing. 10 patients over 5 years. That wasn't imperfect medicine. That was negligence. He said I didn't understand the pressure doctors were under or the impossible standards they were expected to meet. I responded that performing a basic EKG when a patient reported cardiac symptoms wasn't an impossible standard. It was the minimum standard of care. He stood up and walked out without another word. The encounter stayed with me for days afterward. He genuinely believed he was the victim in this situation. He'd lost his license and career because patients like me had demanded accountability instead of accepting his clinical judgment without question. It was the same attitude that had made him dangerous as a physician. The inability to consider that he might be wrong, that patients might know their own bodies better than he assumed, that basic diagnostic tests might reveal problems he'd missed, that arrogance had cost 10 patients their health and nearly cost several of them their lives. And even after losing everything, he still couldn't see it. I completed certification as a patient advocate in June and started volunteering with the Medical Accountability Network full-time. The work involved helping patients navigate medical board complaints, connecting them with attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice, and providing emotional support through the process of seeking accountability for medical negligence. In my first 6 months as a volunteer, I worked with 23 patients who'd experienced various forms of medical harm. Some had suffered delayed diagnoses similar to mine. Others had been victims of surgical errors, medication mistakes, or inappropriate treatment. All of them were navigating the difficult process of trying to hold physicians accountable while dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath of being harmed by someone they'd trusted with their health. The policy changes I'd advocated for with the Medical Accountability Network started gaining traction in the state legislature. A bill requiring more transparent medical board proceedings and creating an online database of physician disciplinary actions passed committee review in August and moved to the full Senate for a vote. The database would allow patients to look up any physician and see if they had a history of disciplinary actions, malpractice settlements, or board complaints. It would make it much harder for physicians with patterns of negligence to simply move to new locations and continue practicing. The bill passed in September, and the database went live in November. I checked Dr. Graves' entry and saw his license revocation listed, along with summaries of the medical board findings and the malpractice verdict. Every patient who searched for him would know what he'd done. I received a letter in December from one of the other patients who'd testified at the medical board hearing. He was the man who'd nearly died from the ruptured appendix. His name was Robert Ellis, and he wrote to thank me for filing the initial complaint that had triggered the investigation. He said he'd been too afraid to report Dr. Graves on his own because he didn't think anyone would believe him or take it seriously. But after seeing my complaint and learning about the other patients, he'd found the courage to come forward. He said the medical board's decision to revoke his license had given him a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Knowing he could never hurt another patient made his recovery feel less meaningless. He'd turned his anger and trauma into action by testifying, and that had helped him heal in ways medication and therapy alone couldn't have achieved. 3 years after everything started, I visited my father's grave and told him the whole story. He'd passed away 2 years before my SVT diagnosis, and I wished he'd been there to support me through everything that followed. He'd worked as a construction foreman for 35 years and dealt with plenty of arrogant people who dismissed workers' safety concerns or treated blue-collar employees poorly. He would have understood exactly what I'd faced with Dr. Graves and would have been the first person encouraging me to fight back. I told him about the lawsuit, the license revocation, the policy changes, and my work as a patient advocate. I explained how his example of standing up for people, even when authority figures disagreed, had influenced my decision to pursue accountability instead of accepting a settlement and moving on quietly. His career had taught me that people in positions of power had immense responsibility, and the people who challenged that power had to be brave and persistent. I like to think he would have been proud. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.